Late one October evening, Jacob found himself driving along a desolate stretch of highway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The glow of his car's dashboard was the only light for miles, apart from the faint silver sheen of moonlight that barely illuminated the asphalt. He was tired, bleary-eyed, and low on gas. A ding from the fuel gauge broke the oppressive silence, alerting him that he needed to refuel soon. As if on cue, a dimly lit gas station appeared on the horizon. It looked like something out of another time, with its peeling paint, flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours," and a single ancient gas pump. The station stood alone, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow the light. Relieved, Jacob pulled into the station and parked by the pump. Stepping out of his car, he immediately noticed the eerie stillness. The air was heavy, and there were no sounds of insects, no rustling of leaves, just an oppressive quiet that pressed against his ears. The single bulb above the pump buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow. Jacob glanced toward the station's small convenience store. The windows were grimy, and though the sign on the door read "Open," the interior appeared dark and empty. He inserted his credit card into the pump, but nothing happened. Frustrated, Jacob looked toward the store again. He noticed movement, a shadow flickering across the window. It was too quick to identify, but it was enough to make him uneasy. He hesitated before heading toward the door, telling himself it was probably just a clerk doing inventory. The bell above the door jingled faintly as he entered. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint metallic smell that turned his stomach. The aisles were cramped, filled with dusty shelves of outdated snacks and faded soda cans. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly. No response. Jacob approached the counter, where an old register sat covered in a thin layer of grime. A rusted bell rested beside it, and he gave it a hesitant tap. The sound seemed to reverberate unnaturally, filling the small store. Moments later, a man appeared from the shadows behind the counter. The clerk looked wrong. His skin was sallow and taut, like it barely fit over his skull, and his sunken eyes were unnervingly wide. He smiled, a grotesque stretch of lips revealing yellowed teeth. "Need some help?" the man rasped. Jacob suppressed a shudder and nodded. "The pump isn't working. Can you turn it on?" The clerk tilted his head slightly, as if confused by the question. Then he nodded slowly. "Of course, but you should hurry. The woods aren't safe this time of night." Jacob frowned. "What do you mean?" The clerk didn't answer. Instead, he shuffled toward a door behind the counter, disappearing into the shadows. Jacob stood there, his unease growing by the second. A faint thud echoed from somewhere in the back, followed by a low, guttural sound that didn't seem human. His fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and Jacob decided he wasn't going to stick around to find out what was going on. He quickly exited the store, the bell above the door jingling faintly behind him. As he reached his car, he saw the pump's screen light up, ready for use. Against his better judgment, he decided to fill up quickly and leave. As he pumped gas, he heard a faint rustling coming from the woods. It started as a soft sound like the wind brushing against leaves, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was footsteps. Multiple sets of them, crunching on the dry leaves. He strained his eyes, peering into the dark tree line, and then he saw them. Shapes, human-like but twisted and malformed, emerged from the shadows of the woods. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, fixed intently on him. Jacob's heart pounded as he fumbled with the nozzle, trying to finish as quickly as possible. Just as he yanked the nozzle from his car and jumped into the driver's seat, the creatures began to move faster, their distorted bodies lurching toward him. He slammed the door shut, locked it, and turned the key in the ignition. The car roared to life, and he sped off, tires screeching against the pavement. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station receded into the distance, but the figures didn't stop. They stood in the middle of the road, watching him until they faded into the darkness. Jacob didn't stop driving until he reached the next town. Even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. For weeks after, he dreamed of their glowing eyes and distorted shapes. He never found the gas station again, though he checked every map and retraced his route. It was as if the place had vanished, like it had never existed. But Jacob knew better.
Story number 2.
It was the dead of night when Olivia found herself on a lonely country road, her gas gauge perilously close to empty. She cursed herself for not stopping earlier, but the stretch of road she was on had been devoid of civilization for miles. Just as she began to panic, a gas station appeared as if summoned from the void. Its glowing sign flickered, spelling out the name Wayfair Fuel, though some of the letters were burnt out, casting strange shadows on the ground. She pulled in, the crunch of gravel beneath her tires unnervingly loud in the quiet. The station looked old, too old. Its pumps were the kind with spinning dials instead of digital displays, and the building itself leaned slightly, as though it were weary from standing for so many years. Olivia hesitated, her instincts telling her to keep driving, but her fuel gauge begged otherwise. She stepped out of her car into the cool night air, which carried a faint, acrid smell she couldn't place. She inserted her card into the pump, but the machine didn't respond. Frustrated, she glanced toward the station's small convenience store. Its interior was dim, but she could see movement, someone inside. Reluctantly, Olivia walked toward the store. As she neared the door, she noticed something strange. There were no advertisements plastered on the windows, no neon beer signs or posters, just bare, dirty glass. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, and an immediate chill washed over her. The store was unnervingly silent. Rows of outdated snacks and faded soda bottles filled the shelves, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. At the counter stood a man, if you could call him that. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, with gaunt features and eyes that seemed too deep-set for his face. His skin had an odd grayish hue, and his thin lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Need help with the pump?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Olivia nodded, her throat dry. "Yeah, it's not working." The man didn't move for a moment, just stared at her with those hollow eyes. Then he nodded slowly and reached beneath the counter, pressing a button. "It's on now. Be careful out there," he said, his tone oddly ominous. She turned to leave, but paused when she saw something at the back of the store. A door slightly ajar, with faint light spilling out from within. There was a sound coming from behind it, a faint, wet, squelching noise that made her stomach churn. She tried to ignore it and stepped back outside, eager to leave. As she filled her tank, Olivia couldn't shake the unease creeping over her. She glanced back at the store, and through the grimy window, she saw the man standing perfectly still, watching her. His head tilted slightly, almost inquisitively, like he was studying her. The pump clicked, signaling her tank was full, and she quickly replaced the nozzle, eager to leave. But as she climbed into her car, she noticed something odd. Her rearview mirror reflected the station behind her, but the man was no longer visible through the store's window. Her unease grew into outright panic when she saw movement in the mirror, a shadow passing just behind her car. She spun around, but there was nothing there. She locked the doors and started the engine, her hands trembling. As she pulled out onto the road, her headlights illuminated something at the edge of the gas station's property. A figure stood just at the tree line, partially obscured by shadow. It wasn't the man from the store, it was something else. Its limbs were elongated, its posture unnaturally hunched, and its head was cocked at an impossible angle. As Olivia drove away, her heart pounding, she glanced in her rearview mirror again. The figure was on the road now, standing in the center of the lane, watching her. Its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, glowing faintly in the dark. She pressed her foot harder on the gas, desperate to put distance between herself and whatever it was. But no matter how far she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her car's interior grew colder, and she swore she could hear faint whispers, though the radio was off. When Olivia finally reached her destination hours later, she was too shaken to speak about what had happened. It wasn't until she noticed the smear on her back windshield, 5 long streaks like claw marks, that she realized whatever had been at that gas station hadn't just watched her. It had followed her.
Story number 3.
The wind howled through the trees as Darren drove along a winding road that seemed to go on forever. He had been on the road for hours, his headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that had descended without warning. The GPS on his phone had been glitching for the past few minutes, and now it was completely dead. Panic began to creep into his thoughts when, just ahead, a faint light appeared through the mist. A gas station. As he pulled in, he felt a strange sense of relief. The place looked old, very old, and was lit only by a flickering bulb above the pump. The gas station was deserted, with no cars in sight, and the only sound was the soft hum of the neon sign. The building itself seemed to lean, as though it had been there much longer than it should have been. Darren stepped out of his car and approached the pump. The air was heavy and damp, smelling faintly of gasoline and something else. Something sour, like rotting meat. He glanced at the convenience store attached to the station. The windows were grimy, and the door was slightly ajar, as though no one had bothered to close it properly. His unease grew, but his fuel was almost gone, and he had no choice but to fill up. He inserted his card into the pump, but the machine didn't respond. With a frustrated sigh, Darren looked toward the store. The door creaked open further, and a figure appeared in the doorway. A man, hunched over, his face hidden in shadow. "Need some help?" The man's voice was gravelly, almost inaudible, but it carried an unsettling calm. Darren nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Yeah, the pump's not working. Could you?" The man didn't answer, just stepped aside, allowing Darren to pass into the store. Inside, the dim light from a flickering overhead bulb barely illuminated the shelves, which were stocked with dusty, outdated snacks. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he walked toward the counter, where the man stood motionless, watching him. "Can I use the bathroom?" Darren asked, trying to ignore the gnawing discomfort in his gut. The man nodded, his eyes never leaving Darren's. Down the hall. Darren walked past him, trying to ignore the odd sense that the man's gaze never wavered, even as he passed. The bathroom was at the back of the store, tucked into a narrow hallway. As Darren opened the door, he was hit with a foul stench, a rancid, rotting smell that made his stomach churn. The room was covered in a thick layer of grime. The mirror cracked, and the light above flickered as though it might go out at any moment. He stepped inside, trying to ignore the eerie feeling crawling up his spine. As he turned toward the toilet, something caught his eye. A small, old-fashioned photograph on the back wall, almost hidden behind a stack of dusty cleaning supplies. It was a photo of the gas station taken years ago, but what chilled him was the group of people in the photo. They were all smiling, but their eyes, every single one, were black, hollow, like empty sockets. His heart raced. Darren quickly turned away, too disturbed to linger any longer. But just as he was about to leave, he heard a faint whisper, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from the dark corner of the room. It was the man's voice, but it sounded wrong, distorted, like it was coming from far away. "Leave now." His blood ran cold. Darren didn't wait. He bolted out of the bathroom, heart pounding, and rushed back to the front of the store. But when he stepped into the main room, the man was no longer there. The store was empty, silent except for the sound of his own breath. Darren didn't stop to look around. He ran outside, his legs heavy with fear. But as he reached his car, he froze. The man stood by the pump, smiling wide, too wide. His teeth were unnaturally sharp, glinting in the dim light. And behind him, the shadows in the trees seemed to stir, as though something was watching from the woods. Without thinking, Darren threw open his car door and slammed the engine into gear. As he sped away, his rearview mirror caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. The man was standing in the middle of the road now, just watching him, his grin impossibly wide. Darren drove for miles, never daring to look back. But when he finally reached the next town, exhausted and shaken, he stopped at a gas station to refuel. As he walked inside, he froze. There, behind the counter, stood the same man. And in his hand, he held the very photograph Darren had seen in the bathroom. The man smiled at him, his eyes empty and dark. "You shouldn't have left," he whispered. Darren never made it home.